Welcome to Lead Smarter, the podcast where you'll hear powerful, no-nonsense conversations about leadership with today's top experts and real-world leaders like yourself. Get the inside strategies, insights, and secrets they've learned on the journey to lead smarter. Let's dive in.
Today's guest is Aurora Dawn Benton, founder of Astrapto and author of Exponential Impact, where she helps organizations harness human potential to drive meaningful social and environmental change. Aurora works at the intersection of sustainability and leadership, but not at the policy level. Her specialty is the micro, the everyday behaviors, conversations, and habits that determine whether change actually sticks. From reducing food waste in hospitality to guiding founders through real change management, she challenges leaders to stop relying on structure alone and start leading through people. In this conversation, we unpack why policies fail without buy-in, the difference between power and force, and how small, consistent leadership behaviors can create outsized impact. Let's get into it.
Hey, Aurora, thank you for joining us on the podcast. I'm really excited to get a chat with you again, and I've enjoyed getting a chance to get to know you leading up to this and just talking to you about your perspective on leadership, really the human element that you focus on in it, and the things that you bring to your own clients and getting them to just improve their own leadership for their own organizations. And I really would love to just jump into some of the things we've talked about. Specifically, we've talked about leading through people and not just plans. How do leaders get misled into thinking structure or policy will fix issues that are actually human in nature?
Well, I think it's natural for leaders to want to do anything that's efficient, that saves time. And I think as humans, it's easy to feel like, well, if I get it and I want it to be efficient and I understand the reasons for doing this, then everyone else will too. But that's not the way humans and relationships work. And so the structure and the policy are really important. So just for the context, right? I do sustainability consulting, so social and environmental initiatives. A lot of times these are new structures and new policies. So not only is it maybe a new thing to do, and you can't underestimate the amount of time it might take to teach someone to regroove a neural pathway that's been around for perhaps a long time. I often am in situations in the hospitality industry, especially where people have been in their jobs or in their type of job for a long time, and not a lot has changed in the way that job is performed in a long time. These are very human-oriented jobs because it's hospitality. You can only automate that so much, right? And so the neural pathway, the muscle memory, the habit, all of that sort of force of nature that can override your best laid intentions, right? So without the buy-in, I often tell, executive chefs, I'll say, like your best laid intentions and your best plans and policies for food waste prevention can be overridden by one ornery, influential banquet captain who calls the kitchen screaming for more chicken. Even though we don't need more chicken, he thinks that he needs more chicken because he's been doing this for a long time, and he thinks he knows what people will eat, even though demographics have changed. The way people eat at events has changed. So there's all of this context and information and research and strategy that people at a line level are really not privy to. And so the person who's setting the structure and setting the policy knows all that. So of course it makes sense to them. They have the demographic data that says people are eating smaller portions of this or less of that, but that is not often conveyed to those who actually have to touch and handle the food. And obviously, there's a wide variety of industry perspectives and contexts. I'm talking specifically about food and hospitality, but you can apply this to anywhere a human being is part of the equation, because people just have their own ways of thinking like, well, this is what we should be doing. This is the way we should be doing it. And so there's this, if there's a lack of really involving people, training people, getting their buy-in on it, then I'll tell you another great example of this when I first started doing this particular work, I remember about 10 years ago, green cleaning in hotels was really taking hold and spreading. And that was, really accelerated during COVID. And anyway, I have been in hotels where the housekeeping staff will bring in products from home because they don't think that the green cleaning works. And unfortunately, what happens is they're not properly trained or given they might be trained like, hey, with this cleaner, you only need to squirt once. But because they don't smell what they're used to smelling with strong cleaners, they spray, 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 which makes the
Right.
cleaner not work. And so then they're like, well, this just doesn't work. And they bring in stuff from home. And so it's such a great example of like, okay, all the reasons why you should want to do green cleaning. It's better for the humans. It's like housekeepers get really bad like ear, nose, and throat issues and all kinds of stuff. So everybody should want this, right? Like this is a win-win-win across the board. But yet, like there are these like sort of visceral, intuitive things like how a cleaner smells that just blew the whole thing up, right? And so no structure or policy is going to predict that. Right? Only until you interact with humans and watch how they behave when new ideas are rolled out, unless you have a conversation with them to understand what are your concerns, then you end up with situations like that. And you think at the top, like, well, yes, we've rolled out green cleaning. Have you though? On paper, you're buying the products, but have you? Because I can tell you what I'm seeing in the back of house closets when I tour hotels.
Well, you just kind of described one of the things I wanted to ask you is like, what do you think like causes leaders to underestimate the complexity of working with humans? And you kind of described, obviously, there's the idea at the top that is based on how you maybe want to be presented to the public or what you're trying to do with your organization. And then there's this disconnect, like you just described, between what you're trying to accomplish as a leader. And then obviously there's these human elements of trying to get your organization to come along behind you and to really, I think, include them I think maybe including them in the process and having them aligned.
Yeah.
I can see as a leader myself, I'm in a small organization. That's super hard to do. I almost think that my biggest responsibility as the leader is not necessarily like secondarily, it's to get the client to buy into what I'm trying to do, but primarily it's to get my team to buy in what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
What do you think causes that disconnect for leaders?
Well, I think it's so it's going to depend a lot on the context and probably a lot on the leader. So for example, in startup environments, it's a constraint and capacity issue, right? Like usually most startup leaders that I am familiar with, and I've worked with startups for a long time, is mostly they really care about their team and really want to be close, even if they're super passionate about solving a problem or a product or service. They also are very excited about the family they've brought around them in the beginning to be part of this thing they're starting, right? So they want to spend a lot of time. That's the way I feel. I want to spend a lot of time with my team. And especially now that we're all virtual and a lot of times our teams aren't even in the same state as us, it becomes harder. But also in the larger corporate environments or even mid-sized companies, you start to get into the hierarchy and the sort of control mechanisms that have been designed into work for centuries, or at least a century now. Right. And a lot of those management principles that I learned in school are hopefully no longer being taught quite as much because they're outdated, quite frankly.
Sure.
But that culture, right? So sort of boomers, Gen X, which is me, and probably, a little bit the millennials have adopted that sort of like, well, it's just the hierarchy and it's just you have to answer and you have to, sort of kiss the butt above you kind of thing. And there's value in that you want people to be consistent, you want continuity, you want compliance, and sometimes you have to have control and hierarchy to be able to do that. But unfortunately, control and hierarchy, especially in not to get super touchy about this, but especially in a sort of toxic masculine kind of corporate culture, which sometimes exists, there's very much a control and hierarchy kind of mentality. And there's no room in that for upward conversations or like managing up, the concept of managing up. There's no room for those conversations. There's no tolerance for those conversations. It's very much a do what I say. And I think probably the overall culture reflects that. That's typically where you'll see a more toxic corporate culture come in. So I think the more a leader understands that the best laid plans must factor in that human element, I think that's going to represent a stronger culture. I mean, quite frankly, that's why when I'm fixing food waste or materials waste or any of the number of environmental or social things I'm doing, I could, if it were just as easy as let me tell you what to do, I could not charge a lot. I could go in and say, here's the things to do. Have fun. But I know the reality of those things not changing right away means you've got to pay me to come in and do a lot more intensive work. I need to come in and spend a whole day with your team. We have to have follow-up accountability. We have to do all these things because it's not as simple as just here's a policy or a process to follow. And so I think that the culture and the success of those processes and policies really go hand in hand.
Yeah, when we talked about it, you were actually just mentioning it now, the kind of startup culture, even in your own company, that you prefer. And when we talked about it, you basically told me that you invest a lot of upfront time helping team members understand their strengths. I wanted you to talk about that a little bit. Why is it so critical, like building a team, investing time in the very beginning to really understand the strengths of your team members?
Well, I tell you, it's partially so that I can understand them, but it's actually a lot more about them understanding themselves. I think people don't spend enough time in reflection, sort of reading books about leadership styles and communication styles and relationships and the problems with all of that and the solutions and the psychology and taking self-evaluations and reflecting on where can I do better and how can I articulate my anger, my frustration, my disappointment, whatever. So part of that is I have always pursued learning about myself in that way. And I always get a lot out of any new type of assessment or book or whatever. I'm always like, I'm just reading a new one that's kind of had me, I'm at a new level of like some new truths coming out that's really exciting. And so I want other people to experience that, but I also know that not everybody naturally gravitates to it. So like usually I find an assessment, like one of my go-tos is the Clifton Strengths Finder, which is actually owned by Gallup. And that particular assessment is, I think it's the results of it are very informative and very enlightening, like illuminating, I should say. And when you learn what other people's strengths are, especially when they're not similar to yours, you start to see like, oh, that's why you do what you do. Okay, so now instead of me being like annoyed that you do this thing that's not how I would do it or not think about it the way I would think about it, I have a greater appreciation for who you are as this layered human that's different than I am. And I also see how you would struggle to see and reconcile the things I'm doing. So I think it gives you a common language to be able to explain, here's what's working for me and here's what's not working for me. And during COVID, I had like 5 interns at one time because especially they're all in college, it was really valuable to give them that exposure because I would say to them like, well, keep me posted on what you like. Do you like what I'm assigning you? Well, they don't know what they don't know, and they don't necessarily have the language to be able to provide feedback like that to someone who, is a boss or a teacher or a mentor. And so I wanted to overtly and explicitly give them like, hey, I want you to do this so that I can learn about you, but I want you to do this so that you can learn about you and that you can have the language to say to me, this is hard for me. And here's why I think it's not just that I don't know how to like do the steps, because that's anybody can learn the steps. It's that this isn't clicking with who I am and what I enjoy. And if it's not what you enjoy, especially because at the time, during COVID, it was like unpaid internships. It's like, well, I want you to at least be happy. If I can't pay you, you want to at least be getting a lot of out of this, right? So yeah, that's something that I find incredibly valuable. And everyone on my team and the interns, and even since then, like the subcontractors I work with, they've all gotten a lot of value out of that. And so it's something that I think is an important choose your own assessment. I use that one, but I think just making sure that you're making space and time for that conversation and for people to express in a unique way, like who am I and how do I fit into this team and this relationship.
Well, you also just said that you're reading some stuff now, some new stuff that you're excited about that's kind of giving you new insights.
Yes.
What are some things that you're reading now that you're seeing as a good resource?
So without it going too esoteric and everything, because this could probably take us down a rabbit hole, I someone pointed me a couple of months ago to this thing called the map of consciousness. And it's sort of these like layers of sentiments and worldviews and very, it's got a lot of pieces and parts to it. And there's some pieces of it that I'm not qualified to explain. But basically, I looked at it, and the lower pieces were things like anger and control and grief and anxiety and all this stuff. And I was like, and then the upper stuff is more about like, efficiency and compassion and just all the positive stuff. Again, I don't have it memorized, but you can imagine sort of the negative stuff and the positive stuff. And I was like, with everything going on in the world right now, I'm really down here in this negative space, like way more than I usually am. And I realized, like, especially as a sustainability professional, like my job is more than anything to not let the world, especially all the people who are anti-environmental and social progress, drag me. That's what they want. They want to drag me into a space of anxiety and fear. And I was like, and I'm letting them win.
It's funny. I was going to ask you, like, how do you battle, like in the face of what seems to be overwhelming? Let's just call it opposition, I guess. How do you battle letting yourself slip into that space? And I mean, you might have just given me a little indication. You seem like you get a little combative about it, and you're not going to let them take that from you.
It's hard not to. And and this kind of goes back a little bit to something we talked about on our call that I'm sure we'll get to in this conversation, and that's the macro versus micro. So one of the things that I realized in looking at that chart is that my job is to stay in the upper part of that chart, because for me to be effective with my audiences, with my clients, with my team, I have to stay there. And so I had to take a hard look at what am I doing that's dragging me into this, social media mainly, and what am I doing to stay here? And so at the time that I started kind of engaging with this, I uninstalled some apps from my phones and refocused some of the way I get some of the information that I need to know about kind of what's going on. And that
when
really
did you do this?
Maybe like a month ago. I would say it's been right about a month that I deleted one of the apps that I was spending more time on than I should. That was really just everything that was kind of in the feed was really, really.
I just did the same thing with TikTok.
Oh yeah. No, I don't use TikTok. For me, it was Facebook. It was just like, it had gotten to the point where I wasn't even seeing anything that any of my friends were doing. I was just like constantly, being fed up the stuff that I was living in the echo chamber and being agitated. Right. And so I made some conscious choices. I also started making conscious choices about what I watch on TV and just some other things that really, so the map of consciousness, one of the books, there's this guy wrote a bunch of books, but one of the books, the book that I picked up is called Power versus Force. And this concept was like, for me, it was this idea. We use the word power in a negative connotation, but in this connotation, it was very much about the fact that power is all about compassion and kindness and listening, and force is force. And I had an epiphany that, like, as an assertive and strong person, I can really lean into force, right? I'm insistent, but there's a fine line between being influential, which I am, I'm good at that, and being insistent, which I also do. And this has been it's been a real like sort of flipped switch for me and one of my friends, she said to me, I mean, I'm being very raw and honest here with you and your audience. One of my friends, which is how I am, so I'm okay with that. But one of my friends, she said to me, she's like, Aurora, you always think everything's going to have to be a battle. Like you're always expecting to have to defend everything. And I was like, she is so right. I grew up in an argumentative home. I was in an argumentative marriage. I'm an argumentative person. Yes, I probably can be downright combative and I'm insistent. And it was just suddenly this switch flipped of like, it doesn't have to be so hard. I overcomplicate it. I overthink it. So I've just been in this, like, all of these things have kind of been flooding into me recently where I'm like, I mean, even just in the last few days, I'm collaborating on a proposal with a friend. And I was just like, I was so excited about it. I was forcing. And I realized like, well, I am forcing and I'm creating a really challenging situation for my friend who, thank God, is just the sweetest, most collaborative and beautiful person. And so she's been very wonderful about, having a lot of grace for me. And it's going to be great. And we, can enjoy working with each other. But it was just like this moment of like, this is an example. This is an example of, you're letting your passion get ahead of you, and it's okay to just stop and let your passion have power rather than force. So it's a real, hopefully your listeners are like, all right, I'm out. This is very, it's very heady stuff, but it's very, it's been, it's been transforming some of the way. I mean, this is always layers, right? So I've been doing this kind of work on myself for years. So a lot of this is not super surprising, but I think it's like the layers of the onion, right? And every time you kind of peel off an onion, you're like, oh, okay, you got to peel off another. This was like a big layer of the onion. This was like, I've been peeling off a bunch of little layers of the onion for years. And this particular one was like a real kind of breakthrough to the next level.
Well, I love the differentiation or the distinction between power and force, and I love that you've rooted power in like passion, I guess, and where it could also, passion could also come out forcefully as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I can definitely see lots of the people I end up talking to, specifically, I'd say founders, people that started the thing, they care about the thing that's literally comes from them. So it's hard to, create that buffer and that space between your passion for that thing and what you're trying to achieve, and giving everybody space to participate in that and at their own speed and strengths, so that you can get something. For me, for example, one thing that was always important to me was I really wanted to create something that was greater than I could accomplish on my own. And the only way I can do that is by giving people the space to do it. Or it's just going to be what I could have done myself anyway, which is likely not as impactful as what can be done with a group of people with diverse skills. So it's always been a challenge for me, though, because most of my time and energy is spent trying to get people across the finish line and finding the balance between maybe I'm not articulating things well enough and getting and communicating to you in the way that you need to hear it, so that you can absorb what I'm saying and find your space in what we're doing and participate.
And do the thing I expect you to do, ultimately, right?
Yeah.
Which is where you like that fine line between power and force. Like, I need you to do the thing that I'm paying you and asking you to do, right?
Yeah.
But how do I invite you into that instead of like pushing you into it? Oh my goodness.
How can I
do that? Fine line.
Yeah. How can I do that thing without it being at the cost of our relationship and what we're trying to do long term? Anyways, I really appreciate that perspective, and it's definitely one I'm going to take from this, because I'm trying to find balance, and I've never thought about the distinction between power and force before.
Powerful,
now, honestly.
Isn't it? I mean, no pun intended, but yeah. I mean, it's very this is a very sort of exposing moment. Like, here you go, world. This is the true, the truth of Aurora. But I also feel like letting people know like where you are. Like, one of the things that came out of that is I was actually talking about this with a friend, and she was kind of like, wait, say that again. I said, I realized that humility is not limiting things, because that's what it can feel like. Oh, I've got to be humble because I did this, I got to shrink because I did this thing. No, humility creates space. It doesn't create something to be afraid of. It doesn't make me smaller, because it can feel that way. Oh, I've got to be humble. I've got to be smaller. No, humility doesn't make me smaller. It creates space for me to be more of who I need to be. And that is like, there's a lot of vulnerability in that, and a lot of like, how do I handle when forced my way? And, so it is humbling. Having that epiphany and owning it is humbling. And humbling can be it's tough, especially for entrepreneurs. Like, we have to kind of puff ourselves up, because who else going, there has to be this level of what feels like force, because we're going against so much, in the world to bring forward this thing that we're trying to do. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how this epiphany and some of my changes in mentality, slow as some of them may be, how this serves me in the things I'm trying to do in the marketplace and with my clients.
Yeah, one of the things I was just thinking of as you're saying this. I mean, you mentioned that you feel that you can be combative. I feel I can see myself being the same way. Sometimes I'll tell people, I know I'm a lot. I'm very aware that I'm a lot.
I say the same thing. Oh my God.
Yep. I tell my wife She's so gracious, and because I know what she has to put up with, and it's a
That's
lot.
funny. It's a lot. Oh, yes. Join the club.
Yeah, and but what I was thinking is like, what I try to do because I can see myself as being combative. One of the things I try to do is like, how can I position whatever it is that I'm trying to, whatever feels like I'm trying to combat, I guess. How can I make sure that what that is the challenge that, if solved, benefits everybody and not focus it on a person?
Mhm. Yeah.
How can I fully remove it, not only from being personal, but focus it in a way that that resolution benefits everybody? And a lot of
Yeah.
times it's actually typically ends up in focusing it inward. Like, what can I change about myself that will make this entire situation better for everybody? Usually
Yes.
that's much easier to do. Well, it's harder to do at first, but it's
It's
easier
harder to
to
get
do
there,
that.
right, but
Yeah,
once you're willing to do it, you have much more control over how you view the world and how you act than you
right.
do over anyone else, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Didn't mean to go off into that tangent. I know one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, you'd mentioned it earlier,
Fine.
was focusing on the micro and to create a meaningful impact. You
Yeah,
actually said that your specialty is the micro, not the macro.
yeah.
What do leaders gain from narrowing their focus like that?
Well, so for me, when I talk about macro versus micro, being a
Mhm.
sustainability professional, I sometimes get asked like, "Well, what do you think the current administration is gonna mean for, the policies of blah, blah, blah?" And I'm like, it's not my specialty. I'm not in advocacy, not I mean, some of the work I do might, kind of touch on that, but I'm
Mhm.
not in politics, I'm not in advocacy, I'm not really tuned into regulations and legislation. A little bit I am because some of the work I do is maybe around reporting and stuff, but I am a lot more leaning into the change management piece, which means I have to be micro focused on behaviors at a line level, at a manager level, at an executive level. And so when I
Mhm.
talk about micro, I'm talking about, or even just thinking about not even thinking about governments or the world, but even thinking about a corporation, like a larger corporation. The macro is sort of like the big picture strategy and the big picture goals, and all of that is the context that I'm when I say I don't focus on, I don't mean that, like, to me, all of that is the important context that we have to operate in. And knowing that is everything for designing the right kind of work. Like, everything I'm trying to do in sustainability is all about how can I enhance your existing strategy? I'm not trying to take over. I'm trying to figure out, like, how does sustainability align with what you're already doing and
Mhm.
make it better. And when I'm talking about micro, I'm really talking about, and then how does that translate to the level of the person who's doing the work, or who has to change something about the way their day goes because now, like, that impacts them on some sort of emotional level, and that can derail your program or make your program successful. I want your program to be successful. So how do we focus on it's the implementation, it's the execution that is
Right.
the micro, in my opinion. And that's just where I'm naturally more gifted and more interested. And so I don't really insert myself into a lot of the, sort of trends, like discussion on what are some trends coming. I get asked that a lot. What are the trends in sustainability? And
Right.
I can answer that a little bit as it relates to hospitality and events, because that's a vertical I'm very deep in. But I'm not really like a let me tell you the trends person. I'm more like, let me tell you why what we've been talking about for 5 years still isn't working. That's what I want to talk about, right? I want to talk about more about the fact that, like, hey, 5 years ago when somebody said this is the trend, we still aren't doing that good. So, or doing that well.
Yeah.
Should we can we
Yep.
can we talk about why that is? Let's stop getting so focused on, like, what the next trend is. How about implementing any trend that's a good thing, like any good trend? How about implementing that at the micro level so that it is now a given part of the culture and the industry norm?
Yeah, and I was actually the way you've described it, I was wondering if you could maybe kind of talk about how do small, like consistent leadership behaviors create like an outsized impact over time? If we're talking about the micro, like
Yeah.
what would be a way you could emphasize that as a
Yeah, so a great example for me is the work I do in food waste. So there's a lot of systems out there for managing food waste that that some have very sophisticated technology. And a lot of times this idea of like, we got to reduce food waste, like any of these, especially in sustainability, but any of these kind of macro ideas, they usually come in as macro thoughts, like reduce food waste. Like I get we're throwing stuff away, we shouldn't throw away, but like translating that, okay, so we're going to start to translate it. And so like, okay, you need to start measure everything, because there's not enough sort of micro level definition of like, what do you need to do? And so it's passed on to someone who kind of has a vague idea of like, yeah, okay, I don't want to waste food. We should work on this. But how has it been translated into the job description of everyone who touches food? And in a food service organization, that's everyone, whether you're the person who buys it, who stores it, who transports it, whether you prepare it, serve it, clean it, whatever. And so what I did when I started going in and doing this work is I started saying like, okay, this is overwhelming, because you could, you have a menu of 100 items. Like, where do you start? You have like how many different SKUs of SKUs of product come in the door. I mean, who knows, right? So I started by just saying like, hey, when I do a training, I'm like, get into groups and write a list on a flip chart of the topmost 10 things you see thrown away here. That's where you start. I don't even know, forget 10, the 2. Let's look at all your list. Okay. Looks like rice and hot dogs. Okay. That seems random, but that's what it seems like everybody around here says you throw away the most. Can we fix rice and hot dogs? Because if you can fix that, what you have fixed is the mindset that's causing you to overproduce rice, over order hot dogs, misunderstand what people want to eat and how they want to eat it, misunderstand the storage of these things, better improve the way you cook them so that the rice is actually delicious or whatever, right? It's not about even specifically how do we reduce waste in rice and hot dogs. It's what are the processes that have led to waste in rice and hot dogs? Because that's probably the same stuff that's leading to the waste in the other things, the other 8 things on your top 10 list.
Right.
I'm less concerned about the results in hot dog waste prevention, but I do measure that, because those numbers speak to the executives. Those numbers speak to the owners. And what I can say, the percent, your food cost of the food waste went from 41% to 25%. That's a number that tells a story and gets the ears of the decision makers, who then allow me to have conversations with line cooks and servers, right? And so helping everyone up and down the chain understand what their role is what matters. And so for the leader, going back to your question, the leader has to then reinforce these small changes that allow people to observe, notice, reflect, share, discuss, because nothing's going to change if those things aren't happening. So rather than overwhelming the system, we're just going to talk about rice for a few weeks, right? And it seems crazy, but if you can't even start with a conversation about rice, you're never going to fix all the other stuff, right? So just starting with, so that's why you always put this thing over here and write this thing on that piece of paper. Okay, well, gosh, that's probably why we're wasting so much rice. Oh, that would also explain why we're wasting bread and other things, right? So if the managers and the leaders are engaging in that conversation and allow themselves to focus on just something as tiny as rice, no pun intended, right? Tiny as rice, then it starts to change the mentality, the culture, the communication that's going to lead to real transformation in culture and in process that ultimately lowers cost and does the other things you want it to do in terms of just any kind of numeric result.
Right. And one of the things, as we start to kind of get towards the end of this episode, you've kind of basically given me a picture of how you help leaders go through change management by exploring the context of what would be important to focus on and maybe address to create improved results inside their organization, for themselves, for their team. If you were to be able to reflect that on yourself, and you were to be able to go back in time and give 60 seconds, you can give yourself one piece of advice, choose the stage in your life. Maybe it's your early 20s. What would that piece of advice be?
Well, yeah, if I could go back to a 34-year-old me and listen to this podcast about leadership, I think my career would have had a different trajectory. I was really all about force at 34 years old, for sure. I was definitely operating in a force mindset. And a lot of that has to do with being a woman of my age, coming up in an environment where women had to act a lot more forceful to be taken seriously. And so I probably would want to go back and say, here's some books to read. And you're not going to be less because you change in these ways. It feels like it's like it's going to make you smaller or less likely to grow, but it's actually the contrary. You're going to grow more, do more, achieve more, and have more impact if you learn this now instead of, 10 years later.
And speaking of books, would one of those books be your own book that you would recommend to yourself,
Yes!
to the young version of you?
Yes, actually, yes, because when I, if I look back at myself, I said 34. That's a little over 20 years ago, and at the time, I was starting to really get interested in social impact, or more social than environmental at the time. I do a lot of both now, but at the time I was very interested in social impact. But I didn't know what to do with that interest. I didn't know what that had to do with my job. I didn't know what to do with that. And there's a lot more answers and pathways for people now than there were 20 years ago. But that's what this book is about. This book is, that's one of the things it's about. It's about helping people who are trying to figure out, how would I make impact a part of my career? And it doesn't mean getting another job or getting a degree necessarily. And that's a lot of what I talk about. Like, how do you do that right where you are right now?
And
It's
for our
also-
listeners, what is
yeah.
that book?
Yeah, Exponential Impact. It's about harnessing human potential to drive sustainability in organizations. And it's really about all the things I've been talking about. It's 4 leadership areas of leadership, which is, and sort of go in order: empathize, enlighten, empower, and encourage. And so kind of stepping through those, there's actually chapters within each of those sections. There's a lot of chapters, and each chapter has discussion questions, because I'm all about, like, how do you apply this in a real world scenario? This isn't all just a bunch of theory. This is very much like, here's how you would sit down with maybe one colleague to say, what can we do differently? And here's some discussion and application activities to consider.
Awesome. Well, thank you for all the time you've given us, for all the insights, including the insights into yourself and the book that you've written that you've just shared with us. I really appreciate your time and have enjoyed this episode. I'm looking forward to chatting with you more.
Thank you so much, David. I enjoyed this as well.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Lead Smarter. And thank you to the partners and sponsors who believe in our mission to evolve ourselves to elevate others. Speaking of elevating others, if you liked this episode, please be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and share. It would mean a lot to me and the team that works so hard behind the scenes so we can all learn together. And of course, thank you to the expert guests who kindly join us as generous guides on our journey to lead smarter.